Morning light slipped softly through the kitchen window. It stretched across the wooden floor, slowly warming the quiet room. Dust floated in the sunlight like tiny drifting stars. The Harper house was just beginning to wake. From the kitchen came the gentle hum of a coffee machine. Mark Harper stood at the counter, scrolling through the morning news on his tablet. His glasses rested low on his nose, the way they always did before his first cup of coffee. Emily Harper poured 2 mugs of coffee beside him. Steam rose slowly into the warm air. It was the kind of calm morning that felt ordinary in the best possible way. Peaceful. Predictable. Comforting. Across the room, a small golden puppy slept in the sunlight. Oliver. The newest member of the Harper family. He lay on his back, paws in the air, ears flopped sideways like soft velvet. One tiny paw twitched as he dreamed. Emily noticed him and smiled. "Look at him," she said quietly. Mark glanced down. Oliver rolled slightly in his sleep, stretching one leg dramatically as if he had all the space in the world. Mark chuckled. "He's already claiming the house." Emily placed a mug in front of him. "Well, technically he lives here now." Mark nodded. 2 weeks. Emily leaned against the counter. 2 weeks since we adopted him. She looked at Oliver again. And it already feels like he's always been here. At the kitchen table, Lily Harper sat with a notebook and a box of crayons. She had been drawing quietly for nearly 20 minutes. That usually meant something important was happening on the page. Emily leaned closer. "What are you working on?" Lily turned the notebook around proudly. It was Oliver. Or at least, Lily's version of Oliver. The puppy had giant floppy ears, a wagging tail, and a huge smiling face. Above the drawing she had written carefully, "Oliver, best dog ever." Mark laughed. That might be the most accurate portrait in history. Lily grinned. On the floor, Oliver's ear twitched. The sound of his name floated gently into his dreams. Slowly, he stretched. First one paw, then the other. His small body lengthened across the warm floorboards. For a moment he simply lay there, blinking slowly. Dogs wake differently than people. No alarm clocks. No rush. Just quiet awareness. Oliver lifted his head. His soft brown eyes scanned the room. Emily. Mark. Lily. The table. The sunlight. Everything familiar. Everything calm. His tail tapped the floor once. Then again. Emily crouched down. "Good morning, Oliver." The puppy stood and padded toward her. His steps were still a little clumsy with sleep. He gently pressed his head into her hand. Emily scratched behind his ears. Oliver closed his eyes instantly. That spot was his favorite. Mark watched the moment with a small smile. "You know," he said, "the shelter told me he might be shy for the first few weeks." Emily laughed softly. "Shy?" She looked down at Oliver, who had now leaned his entire body against her leg like a furry little tower. "I think they misjudged him." Mark crouched beside them. Oliver looked at him carefully. Those eyes again. Calm. Curious. Almost thoughtful. Mark had noticed that look before. Sometimes Oliver watched people in a strange way. Not just seeing them, but studying them. As if he were trying to understand something deeper. "Hey buddy," Mark said gently. Oliver wagged his tail slowly. Then he stepped forward and rested his chin briefly on Mark's knee. Just for a moment. A quiet little connection. Mark scratched under the puppy's collar. "You're an interesting little guy." Emily tilted her head slightly. I've noticed something about him. What? He watches people. Mark nodded slowly. I noticed that too. Lily looked up from the table. That means he's smart. Oliver turned his head immediately toward her voice. His ears perked. Lily giggled. See? The room felt warm and calm. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere down the street, a car door closed. A quiet sound. Barely noticeable. But Oliver's ears lifted. Just slightly. His body stayed relaxed. But his attention shifted. Dogs hear the world differently. Small sounds carry meaning. Signals. Movement. Presence. Oliver listened. Another car door closed. Closer this time. The puppy slowly lifted his head. His eyes turned toward the hallway. Emily noticed the movement. What is it? Oliver stood. His tail moved once. Slow. Calm. He walked a few steps toward the front door. Then stopped. Listening. Mark glanced toward the window. Probably someone next door. But Oliver remained still. Focused. Waiting. Emily wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. You expecting someone? Mark shook his head. No. A moment passed. Quiet again. Then suddenly, the doorbell rang. A soft chime echoed through the house. Oliver's ears perked high. But he didn't bark. Didn't jump. Instead, he walked calmly toward the door. Tap. 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 His nails clicked softly against the wooden floor. Emily exchanged a curious look with Mark. Well, that's new. Mark followed him. Oliver reached the door first. Then he sat down. Perfectly still. His tail moved slowly across the floor. Back and forth. Like he already knew who was there. Mark opened the door. Standing on the porch was an older man. Gray hair. Kind eyes. He held a small cardboard package under one arm. Morning, the man said politely. Sorry to bother you. I think a package of mine ended up here by mistake. Mark smiled. Oh sure, let me check. But he stopped. Because Oliver had stood up. The puppy walked forward slowly. His tail wagging now. Steady. Confident. The man looked down. Oliver walked straight to him. Then sat. Right in front of him. Looking up. Tail sweeping happily across the welcome mat. For a moment, nobody spoke. The man blinked in surprise. Emily stepped closer behind Mark. That's strange. Mark frowned slightly. Oliver leaned forward, gently placing one paw on the man's shoe. The man crouched slowly. Well now. His hand hovered above the puppy's head. Oliver moved closer immediately, pressing his head warmly into the man's hand. Like greeting someone he had missed. The man froze. His fingers resting in the puppy's fur. His eyes searched Oliver's face. That's odd. Emily looked at Mark. Oliver has never met him before. Mark nodded slowly. Not that we know of. Oliver's tail wagged faster now. His whole body relaxed. Happy. Certain. The man shook his head gently. I swear. He looked at the puppy again. This little guy acts like he knows me. Oliver gazed up at him calmly. Like the answer was obvious. Like the connection already existed. Even if no one else understood it yet. And in that quiet moment, a small mystery quietly stepped into the Harper family's home. The older man remained crouched on the porch. His hand rested gently on Oliver's head. For a few quiet seconds, no one moved. Oliver's tail kept sweeping across the welcome mat in slow, happy arcs. Not wild excitement. Not the playful greeting he gave strangers. This was calmer. Warmer. Almost familiar. The man finally spoke. "Well, aren't you friendly?" Oliver leaned forward again, pressing his head softly into the man's palm. The man chuckled under his breath. "That's quite a welcome." Mark stepped aside slightly. "Sorry about that. He usually doesn't do this with people he just met." Emily nodded from behind him. "Actually, he's never done this with anyone." The man looked up. A little puzzled. "Well, I certainly don't mind." Oliver sat down again. Still looking up at him. Watching him carefully. Almost thoughtfully. The man scratched behind the puppy's ear. Oliver closed his eyes instantly. Like he knew that exact spot. The man paused. His fingers stopped moving for a moment. Then he scratched there again. Oliver's tail thumped happily against the wooden porch. The man blinked. "That's interesting." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What is?" "Well," the man said slowly, "most dogs take a minute to show you where they like to be scratched." He rubbed the same place again. Oliver leaned into it perfectly. Like he had done this many times before. The man smiled faintly, but something thoughtful passed through his expression. Emily stepped forward. "Sorry, we didn't introduce ourselves." She extended her hand. "I'm Emily." The man stood up, gently brushing his hands together. "George Carter." Mark shook his hand next. "Mark. Nice to meet you." George nodded toward the puppy. "And this welcoming committee?" "Oliver," Lily announced proudly from the doorway. George smiled down at her. "Well, Oliver certainly seems to know how to greet a neighbor." Oliver wagged his tail again at the sound of his name. Then he stepped forward once more, pressing gently against George's leg. George looked down again. A little more curious now. "Well now, you're persistent." Mark laughed lightly. He's normally calm like this. But this level of enthusiasm is new. Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. "He's acting like he recognizes you." George chuckled. "Well, I'm pretty sure I would remember meeting a puppy this charming." Oliver gazed up at him again. Calm. Focused. Studying his face. Almost as if he were checking something. George noticed the look. "That's quite an intense stare you've got there, buddy." Oliver blinked slowly. His tail still moving. Then he sat again. Right at George's feet. Like that was exactly where he belonged. A gentle silence settled for a moment. Wind moved softly through the trees lining the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower hummed faintly in the distance. George shifted the small box under his arm. "Oh right, the package." Mark nodded. "Let me check inside." He stepped back into the hallway. Oliver stayed exactly where he was. Sitting beside George. Emily watched the puppy closely. "That's so strange." George glanced at her. "What is?" "He just trusts you." Oliver rested one paw lightly on George's shoe again. The same small gesture as before. George looked down. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "You know, dogs have incredible instincts." Emily nodded. "That's what everyone says." George crouched again slowly. Oliver leaned closer. George studied the puppy's face. Those soft brown eyes. the golden fur around his ears, a tiny white patch under his chin. Something about the little dog seemed familiar. But George couldn't place it. He scratched Oliver's neck again. The puppy sighed happily. "That's the spot, huh?" Oliver's eyes closed halfway. Completely relaxed. George chuckled softly. "Well, I feel like I'm being evaluated." Emily smiled. "Maybe you passed." At that moment Mark returned from inside holding a small cardboard package. "Found it." George stood up again. "Well, thank you very much." He accepted the box. Oliver immediately stood too, his tail wagging again. George looked down. "You're coming to walk me out?" Oliver followed him one step toward the driveway. Then another. Like escorting him. Emily laughed quietly. "Look at that." Mark shook his head with a smile. "I think you made a new friend." George stepped onto the path leading away from the porch. Oliver stopped at the edge of the steps. Watching him carefully, George paused halfway down the walkway. He turned back. Oliver was still there, sitting neatly at the top step, tail moving slowly, eyes calm. Watching him leave, George smiled. "Well, Oliver, it was nice meeting you." Oliver gave a small happy wiggle. George chuckled. Then he continued walking down the driveway. But after a few steps, he slowed. Something about that moment tugged at his thoughts. He turned again. Oliver was still watching him. Not confused. Not curious. Just certain. Like he had been expecting him. George frowned slightly. Then he looked back at the puppy one last time. "Ha," he murmured to himself. "That's strange." Inside the house, Emily folded her arms. "That was unusual." Mark nodded slowly. "Very unusual." Oliver finally turned and trotted back inside, his tail still wagging happily, like he had just greeted someone important. Emily looked down at him. "You've never met him before, buddy." Oliver looked up at her calmly. Then he blinked once, as if the answer were obvious. But the question had only just begun. The house slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Mark closed the front door. Emily walked back toward the kitchen. Lily returned to her drawing at the table. But Oliver paused in the middle of the hallway. His tail still wagged slowly, like he was thinking about something. Emily noticed. "You're in a good mood today." Oliver looked up at her, then trotted happily back into the kitchen. The sunlight was still warm on the floor. He circled once, twice, then flopped down exactly where he had been earlier. But his eyes stayed open, watching the front door. Mark leaned against the counter again. "Well, that was interesting." Emily nodded. "I've never seen him greet someone like that." Mark sipped his coffee. "Maybe he just likes the guy." "Maybe." But Emily didn't sound convinced. She glanced at Oliver again. He didn't act like he liked him. Mark looked over. "What do you mean?" He acted like he knew him. Oliver blinked slowly, still watching the hallway. Lily looked up from her drawing. Maybe Oliver remembers him. Mark smiled at her. "Sweetheart, we adopted Oliver 2 weeks ago." "Yeah," Lily said. "But maybe they met before." Emily and Mark exchanged a small look. It was a simple idea, but it lingered in the air longer than expected. Mark shrugged. "Well, anything's possible." Oliver's ears twitched again. A car engine started outside. He sat up immediately. Emily noticed. Again? Oliver stood. Slowly. He walked toward the window this time. Peeking through the curtain. His tail moved again. Back and forth. Mark chuckled. Looks like someone made a strong impression. Oliver watched the driveway carefully. Then after a moment, he relaxed again, trotting back to his sunny spot. The morning passed peacefully. Breakfast. Dishes. Lily packing her school bag. Oliver followed everyone from room to room like a tiny golden shadow. By mid-afternoon the house was quiet again. Emily sat on the couch reading. Oliver slept beside her, one paw stretched across her leg. Outside, the street was calm. A few cars passed. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze. Then suddenly, Oliver's head lifted. His ears perked. Emily glanced down. What is it? Oliver stood. His tail wagged once. Then he walked straight to the front door. Tap. 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 His nails clicked softly against the floor. Emily frowned slightly. No one rang the bell. But Oliver sat anyway. Right in front of the door. Waiting. A few seconds passed. Then. Knock. Knock. Emily blinked. Well, that's impressive. She opened the door. Standing outside again was George Carter. This time without the package. He smiled politely. Afternoon. Sorry to bother you again. Emily laughed softly. I think Oliver knew you were here before we did. George looked down. Sure enough. Oliver was already wagging his tail. Sitting at his feet. Exactly like before. George chuckled. Well, now that's quite the greeting. Oliver stepped forward happily, pressing his head against George's hand. George scratched behind his ears again. The same spot. Oliver melted into the touch immediately. George paused again. That thoughtful expression returned. Huh. Emily noticed. What? George shook his head slightly. Just funny. What is? Well. He scratched Oliver's neck slowly. This little guy acts like we've known each other for years. Oliver wagged harder. Emily smiled politely. He does seem very comfortable with you. George nodded slowly. Then he crouched again, studying Oliver more closely. You know. Oliver looked up at him. Eyes bright. Focused. George tilted his head slightly. I've had dogs most of my life. Oliver leaned closer. And dogs don't usually trust someone this fast. Emily folded her arms thoughtfully. That's exactly what we were saying this morning. George scratched Oliver's chin. The puppy sighed happily. So tell me, George said gently. Where did you adopt him from? Emily answered. Greenridge Animal Rescue. George nodded slowly. That's a good place. Oliver suddenly licked George's hand. A quick happy gesture. George laughed quietly. Well now. I'm definitely approved. Emily smiled. You might be his favorite person outside the family. George looked down again. His eyes narrowing slightly, not suspicious. Just curious. There's something familiar about him. Oliver wagged again. Then he sat neatly in front of George, staring up with calm certainty. George studied the puppy's face. The golden fur. The small white patch under his chin. The soft brown eyes. Something tugged gently at the edge of his memory. But the thought slipped away before he could catch it. George stood again. Well, I actually came over to ask something. Emily raised an eyebrow. Sure. My lawnmower died on me this morning. He chuckled lightly. I was wondering if you happen to have one I could borrow. Emily nodded immediately. I think Mark has one in the garage. She called toward the hallway. Mark? Footsteps approached. Mark appeared a moment later. What's up? Emily gestured toward George. Neighbor needs a lawnmower. Mark smiled. Of course. George thanked him. As the two men walked toward the garage, Oliver followed. Right beside George. Like a small loyal companion. George noticed and laughed softly. Well, look at that. Oliver wagged happily. George glanced down again, thoughtful. You really do seem to recognize me, don't you? Oliver simply looked up at him. Calm. Certain. As if the answer was already written somewhere deep in his memory. But no one knew why. Not yet. The garage door creaked open slowly. Afternoon sunlight streamed inside, lighting up shelves of tools, garden supplies, and old cardboard boxes stacked neatly along the wall. Mark walked toward the back corner. I think the mower's over here somewhere. George stepped inside behind him. Oliver followed closely at George's side. Not running. Not wandering. Just calmly walking beside him. Like they had done it 100 times before. George noticed. He glanced down. Well, looks like I've got a helper. Oliver's tail wagged in slow, happy sweeps. Mark lifted the lawn-mower handle. Here we go. He pulled it forward slightly. Still works fine. George nodded gratefully. Thank you, I appreciate it. Oliver sat beside George again. Watching him carefully. Mark chuckled. You've got a fan. George scratched the back of his neck. It seems that way. Oliver leaned gently against George's leg. Not jumping. Not begging for attention. Just close. George looked down again. That same thoughtful expression crossed his face. You know. Mark glanced up. What? George hesitated. Then he crouched slowly. Oliver immediately leaned forward. George studied the puppy's face carefully. His fingers moved gently through the soft golden fur. The little white patch under the chin. The shape of his ears. The calm brown eyes. Something stirred again in the back of George's mind. A quiet memory trying to surface. But it stayed just out of reach. George sighed softly. Strange. Mark tilted his head. What is? George shook his head lightly. I can't explain it. Oliver rested his paw lightly on George's shoe again. The same gentle gesture as before. George laughed quietly. All right, you've made your point. He scratched Oliver behind the ear. Exactly the spot the puppy loved most. Oliver's eyes closed halfway. Mark watched with a smile. He doesn't usually warm up to people this fast. George nodded slowly. Most dogs don't. For a moment, the garage filled with comfortable silence. Dust floated in the sunlight. Outside, birds chirped softly in the trees. Oliver opened his eyes again. Still looking at George. Focused. Patient. George noticed. You keep staring at me like that. Oliver wagged his tail slowly. George smiled faintly. I feel like you're trying to remember something. Mark leaned against the workbench. Well, Emily had a theory earlier. George looked up. What kind of theory? That maybe Oliver met you before. George raised an eyebrow. Before today? Yeah. George chuckled softly. Well, I moved here 3 weeks ago. Mark nodded. Right. And we adopted Oliver 2 weeks ago. George looked down at the puppy again, his expression thoughtful. So, unless we met somewhere else? His voice trailed off. Oliver tilted his head slightly, watching him. George rubbed his chin. You said you adopted him from Greenridge Animal Rescue, Mark replied. George froze for a second. Just a small pause. But noticeable. Mark saw it. You know it? George nodded slowly. Actually, yeah. Oliver's ears perked. George looked down again. A soft realization beginning to form, though not fully clear yet. Well, I'll be. Mark noticed the shift. What? George stood slowly. Well, I volunteer sometimes. Volunteer? At Greenridge. Mark blinked. You do? George nodded. Mostly small stuff. He shrugged modestly. Walking dogs, helping with transfers, that sort of thing. Oliver's tail wagged faster. Mark smiled. Well, that explains why he likes you. George looked down again. But his expression was still thoughtful. Maybe. Oliver stepped closer again, pressing gently against George's leg. George crouched once more. His hand moved slowly along the puppy's back. Thinking. Searching his memory. You know, they get a lot of dogs through there. Mark nodded. I imagine so. George scratched Oliver's neck again. But sometimes, certain ones stick in your memory. Oliver gazed up at him. Calm. Hopeful. Like he was waiting for George to understand. George looked closely at the puppy's face again. Golden fur. Brown eyes. That little white patch under the chin. His brow furrowed slightly. Wait. Mark leaned forward. What? George shook his head slowly. I'm not sure. Oliver's tail wagged again. George studied him one more time. Then smiled gently. Well, even if I don't remember exactly. He scratched Oliver's head. I think this little guy remembers me. Oliver wagged harder. His whole body relaxed. Mark laughed quietly. Well, looks like you made a lasting impression. George stood again and lifted the mower handle. Thanks again for this. Any time, Mark said. George walked toward the driveway. Oliver followed him again. Right beside him. Step for step. Mark watched from the garage, shaking his head with a smile. That dog. George reached the walkway. He stopped, looking down at Oliver. You coming home with me? Oliver wagged his tail happily. But he stayed where he was, at the edge of the driveway. George smiled. Thought so. He started walking down the path. After a few steps he glanced back. Oliver was still there, sitting calmly, watching him, like he always knew he'd be back. George slowed slightly. That strange familiar feeling returned. A memory waiting just beneath the surface. He couldn't explain it yet. But one thing was becoming clear. This little rescue pup remembered something. Something important. And the truth was getting closer. The sound of the lawnmower slowly faded down the street. Mark closed the garage door and walked back toward the house. Oliver followed beside him, his tail still moving in slow, thoughtful sweeps. Inside, Emily was clearing the kitchen counter. She looked up when they entered. "Well?" Mark smiled. "He borrowed the mower." Emily nodded. "And Oliver escorted him again, I assume?" Mark laughed. "You could say that." Oliver walked to his water bowl and took a few quiet drinks. But his eyes occasionally flicked toward the front door. Emily noticed. "He's still thinking about him." Mark leaned against the counter. "I think George made an impression." Emily dried her hands with a towel. "Or maybe Oliver remembers something." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You still thinking about that?" Emily shrugged gently. "I don't know, but it just feels unusual." Oliver walked over and rested beside her feet. Calm. Comfortable. Mark looked down at the puppy. "You were pretty determined out there, huh?" Oliver wagged once. Emily watched him thoughtfully. Then suddenly she turned toward the living room. "Wait a second." Mark looked confused. "What?" Emily walked to the coffee table and picked up her laptop. "I want to check something." Mark followed. "Check what?" She sat on the couch and opened the laptop. The shelter website. Mark sat beside her. "You think they might have something about Oliver?" Emily nodded. "Sometimes they post intake photos or history notes." Oliver jumped onto the couch between them. "Curious." Emily typed slowly. "Greenridge Animal Rescue." The familiar website appeared. Warm photos of dogs. Adoption success stories. Volunteer announcements. Emily clicked the recent adoptions section. "Let's see." Mark leaned closer. Oliver rested his chin on Emily's arm. Watching the screen. Emily smiled. "You want to help?" Oliver blinked calmly. She scrolled slowly through photos. Happy families. Dogs leaving the shelter. A few familiar faces from the day they visited. Then suddenly, there. Mark leaned forward. "That's him." A small photo appeared on the screen. Oliver sitting inside a kennel at the shelter. The same golden fur. The same curious eyes. The same little white patch under his chin. Emily clicked the photo. Oliver tilted his head slightly at the image of himself. Mark chuckled. "You see that?" Emily smiled. "He's recognizing himself." The page loaded. Name, Oliver. Age, 4 months. Breed, Golden Retriever mix. Status, adopted. Emily scrolled further down. Then she stopped. "Huh." Mark looked over. "What?" "There's a note here." She read quietly. "Found near Eastwood Park walking trail. Brought in by local volunteer." Mark frowned slightly. "Volunteer?" Emily nodded slowly. Oliver lifted his head. Emily scrolled down further. Then she read the next line. Intake handled by volunteer caretaker, George Carter. Mark blinked. "Wait." Emily looked at him. "That's him." Mark leaned back in surprise. "You're kidding." Emily turned the screen toward him. "Nope." Mark stared at the words for a moment. Then he laughed softly. "Well, I guess that explains a lot." Oliver wagged his tail gently. Emily continued reading. Puppy was found alone near trail entrance. Appeared healthy but frightened. Volunteer stayed with the dog until transferred to shelter. Mark looked down at Oliver. "You remember him, don't you?" Oliver gazed back calmly. Emily scrolled again. There was a small photo below the note. Oliver sitting on the grass. And beside him, a familiar pair of jeans and brown work boots. George, holding a water bottle, kneeling beside the tiny puppy. Oliver leaned closer to the screen. His tail started wagging faster. Emily smiled softly. "Well, look at that." Mark shook his head. "So George was the one who found him?" Emily nodded. "And he stayed with him?" Mark read the note again. "Until the shelter picked him up." Emily closed the laptop slowly. "Well..." She looked down at Oliver. "That explains why he recognized him." Oliver wagged happily. Mark smiled warmly. "You remembered the guy who helped you." Oliver stretched and rested his head on Mark's leg. Emily leaned back against the couch. "That must have been scary for him." Mark nodded. "Being alone out there." Emily scratched Oliver behind the ear. "But George stayed with him." Oliver sighed softly. Relaxed. Content. The mystery was beginning to make sense. Mark looked toward the window. "You know, he probably thought George was coming back." Emily nodded slowly. "And today, he finally did." Oliver closed his eyes. His tail still moved gently against the couch, as if the world had quietly settled back into place. But somewhere down the street, George pushed the lawnmower across the grass. And every now and then, he caught himself thinking about the little puppy, the one who greeted him like an old friend. And he still couldn't shake the feeling that Oliver had been waiting for him. The afternoon sun hung low over the neighborhood. Soft golden light stretched across George Carter's front yard as he pushed the borrowed lawnmower slowly through the grass. The steady hum of the machine filled the quiet street. But George's mind wasn't on the lawn. It kept drifting back to one small golden puppy. Oliver. The way he had run up to him. The way he sat at his feet. The way he looked at him. Like they had already met. George reached the end of the yard and stopped the mower. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Then he looked toward the Harper house down the street. A faint smile appeared. "Well, I'll be." He turned the mower off. The quiet afternoon returned. Birds chirped softly. Leaves rustled in the breeze. And slowly, a memory began to return. 2 months earlier. It had been a cool morning at Eastwood Park. George walked along the wooded trail with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He volunteered with Green Ridge Animal Rescue whenever he could. Sometimes that meant transporting animals. Sometimes helping at the shelter. And sometimes it meant walking the park trails, looking for lost or abandoned pets. It was quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees. The trail was mostly empty. George walked slowly, listening to the sounds of nature around him. Birds whined through the leaves. The soft crunch of gravel under his boots. Then he heard something. A tiny sound. So faint he almost missed it. A soft whimper. George stopped walking. He listened carefully. There it was again. A small cry. Somewhere off the trail. George stepped carefully toward the bushes. Hello? No answer. Just another soft whine. George crouched and gently moved a few branches aside. And that's when he saw him. A tiny golden puppy, curled up beside a fallen log. His fur dusty. His small body trembling slightly. George's heart softened instantly. Well, hey there, little guy. The puppy looked up. Big brown eyes filled with uncertainty. But he didn't run. He simply watched. George slowly knelt down. It's okay. His voice was calm and gentle. The puppy sniffed the air, then took one small step forward. George extended his hand slowly. No sudden movements. No pressure. Just patience. The puppy moved closer, one tiny step at a time, until his nose touched George's fingers. George smiled warmly. Well, hello. The puppy sniffed again. Then something surprising happened. His tail wagged. Just once. George chuckled softly. There you go. He gently stroked the puppy's head. Soft golden fur. Warm. Alive. The puppy leaned slightly into his hand, like he had been waiting for someone. George glanced around the quiet trail. Now what are you doing out here all alone? No collar. No leash. No sign of an owner nearby. The puppy whimpered again softly. George sighed. Well, looks like you when I need to make a phone call. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small water bottle, carefully pouring some into the lid. There you go, buddy. The puppy sniffed the water, then began drinking eagerly. George watched him. Something about the little dog touched his heart immediately. Maybe it was the way he stayed so close, or the way those brown eyes kept watching him. George gently rubbed behind the puppy's ears. The puppy's eyes closed halfway, and for the first time, his tail wagged properly. Back and forth. Happy. George smiled. I guess we're friends now. He sat beside the puppy for nearly 20 minutes, waiting for the shelter transport team to arrive. The puppy stayed close the entire time, sometimes sitting beside him, sometimes resting his tiny paw on George's boot, like he didn't want the man to leave. George chuckled quietly. You're a loyal little guy. When the rescue van finally arrived, the volunteer stepped out. Well, what do we have here? George gestured toward the puppy. Found him near the trail entrance. The puppy immediately pressed closer to George. The volunteer smiled. Looks like he picked you. George laughed softly. Feels that way. He gently lifted the puppy into his arms. The puppy rested comfortably against his chest. Warm. Trusting. George carried him to the van. You're going somewhere safe now. The puppy licked his chin once. George laughed. All right, all right. He handed the puppy to the volunteer. But for a moment, the puppy looked back. Those same calm brown eyes, watching George carefully, as if trying to remember him. George scratched behind his ears one last time. You'll be all right, buddy. The van door closed gently, and the rescue team drove away. George stood in the quiet parking lot, smiling to himself. Well, that was a good day. Back in the present. George leaned on the lawnmower handle. The memory finished settling into place. He laughed quietly to himself. So that's it. Oliver hadn't been greeting a stranger. He had been greeting the man who found him. The man who stayed beside him when he was alone. George looked down the street again, toward the Harper house. That little guy remembered. He shook his head in amazement. Dogs. The evening breeze moved softly through the neighborhood, and somewhere inside the Harper house, Oliver lifted his head. His ears perked slightly, as if he could feel the connection still there, even from across the street. The sun was beginning to set. Warm golden light poured through the Harper family's living room windows, stretching long shadows across the wooden floor. Emily sat on the couch, the laptop still open beside her. Mark leaned back in his chair across the room. And Oliver. Oliver lay comfortably on the rug between them. But every now and then, his ears lifted. Listening. Waiting. Emily watched him with a small smile. He's doing it again. Mark looked up. What? That listening thing. Oliver's head tilted slightly toward the front door. Mark chuckled. Well, maybe he's expecting another visitor. Almost on cue. A soft knock sounded at the door. Oliver jumped to his feet immediately. His tail wagged fast now. Excited. But still calm. Like he knew exactly who it was. Emily laughed quietly. Okay, that's impressive. She walked to the door. When she opened it, George Carter stood on the porch. He smiled warmly. Evening. Emily smiled back. Hi, George. But before she could say anything else, Oliver appeared beside her, his tail wagging happily. George looked down and laughed. Well, look who it is. Oliver stepped forward eagerly, pressing his head gently into George's hand. George crouched immediately. There you are, buddy. He scratched behind Oliver's ears. The puppy melted into the touch. Eyes closing halfway. Tail sweeping across the porch. Mark walked up behind Emily. Evening, George. George nodded. Just came to return the mower. He gestured toward the driveway. Works perfectly, by the way. Mark smiled. Glad it helped. Oliver remained glued to George's side, following every small movement. Emily crossed her arms playfully. All right, now we understand. George looked up. Understand what? Emily gestured toward Oliver. He remembers you. George smiled knowingly. I figured that out today. Mark raised an eyebrow. Oh. George leaned back slightly on his heels. I remembered where we met. Oliver wagged faster. Emily leaned forward with interest. Really? George nodded. Eastwood Park. Mark smiled. That's where you found him. George blinked. You know? Emily nodded and pointed toward the living room. We looked up his shelter record. George chuckled softly. Well, that explains a lot. Oliver rested his paw gently on George's knee. George patted his head. You remember that day, don't you? Oliver gazed up at him. Calm. Happy. Certain. Emily stepped onto the porch. Do you remember what happened that day? George smiled thoughtfully. Pretty clearly, actually. He glanced down at Oliver. This little guy was hiding beside a fallen log. Oliver's ears twitched. George continued. Tiny thing. Covered in dirt, shaking a little. Emily's expression softened. Mark leaned quietly against the doorframe. George scratched Oliver's neck slowly. I sat with him for about 20 minutes before the rescue team arrived. Oliver leaned into him again. Emily noticed. He stayed close to you? George laughed softly. Like glue. Oliver wagged harder. George continued. Every time I tried to stand up, he followed me. Emily smiled. That sounds like him. George looked down at the puppy. You didn't want to be alone again, did you? Oliver rested his head briefly against George's arm. A quiet moment passed. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. Emily finally spoke again. You know what's amazing? George looked up. What? This whole time, we thought Oliver just liked you. Mark chuckled. Turns out he was greeting an old friend. George smiled warmly. Well, I'm honored. Oliver wagged happily. George scratched behind his ears again. You've got a good home now, buddy. Emily nodded proudly. We love him. George stood slowly. Oliver followed him again. Every step. Emily laughed quietly. He still thinks you're leaving him again. George looked down at the puppy, then crouched one last time. Oliver sat immediately in front of him, waiting. George rubbed the puppy's chest gently. Listen, pal. Oliver stared up at him. You don't have to worry anymore. His voice was soft and warm. You've got a family now. Oliver's tail slowed, but his eyes stayed locked on George. George smiled. And I'm right down the street. Oliver wagged again. Satisfied. Mark stepped forward. You're welcome to visit any time. George laughed. Careful. I might take you up on that. Emily smiled. I think Oliver would approve. George stood again. Oliver walked with him to the edge of the driveway. Just like before. George paused halfway down the path. Looking back, Oliver sat at the top step, watching him. But this time, there was no confusion. No worry. Just calm trust. George raised a hand. See you later, buddy. Oliver wagged slowly. The warm evening light faded as George walked back down the street. Inside the Harper house, Emily looked at Mark. That was beautiful. Mark nodded. Dogs remember kindness. Oliver finally turned and trotted back inside, his tail moving gently. Because now, the mystery had become something much simpler. Something warmer. Oliver hadn't been acting strangely. He had simply been recognizing the person who helped him when he needed it most. A few weeks passed. Spring slowly settled into the neighborhood. Trees filled with fresh green leaves. Warm sunlight stretched longer into the evenings. And life inside the Harper house found its comfortable rhythm again. Morning coffee. School runs. Quiet afternoons. And Oliver, always nearby. But one small thing had changed. Every few days, a familiar knock appeared at the door. And every time, Oliver knew. Long before the sound reached human ears. One soft Saturday afternoon, Emily was watering the flowers near the front window. Mark was fixing a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. Lily sat on the floor coloring beside Oliver. The puppy rested calmly beside her crayons. Then suddenly, Oliver's ears perked up. His head lifted. Lily noticed immediately. Oliver? His tail began to wag. Slowly. Then faster. He stood and trotted toward the front door. Tap, tap, tap. His little paws clicked across the wooden floor. Emily laughed from the window. I think we have a visitor. A second later. Knock. Knock. Lily jumped up excitedly. It's him. Emily opened the door. And sure enough, George Carter stood there with a friendly smile. Afternoon. But before anyone could say another word, Oliver had already reached him, his tail wagging like a tiny golden flag. George laughed warmly. Well, hello again, partner. Oliver leaned happily against his leg. George crouched down and scratched behind his ears. You've been waiting for me? Oliver wagged harder. Emily shook her head with a smile. He always knows when you're coming. George chuckled. I guess we made an impression on each other. Lily ran to the door. "Hi, Mr. George." George waved cheerfully. "Hey there, Lily." Oliver sat beside him proudly, like he was welcoming an old friend. Mark walked over from the kitchen. "You're becoming a regular around here." George smiled. "Well, I had to check on my old trail buddy." Oliver tilted his head slightly. George laughed softly. "That's what you are now." He scratched Oliver's chest gently. "A trail buddy." Oliver leaned closer. Completely relaxed. Completely happy. Emily stepped aside. "Come in." George entered the house. Oliver followed him closely. Like always, they all sat in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Oliver stretched out between George and Lily. George rubbed the puppy's belly slowly. "You've grown since I found you." Oliver wagged. Lily giggled. "He eats a lot." George laughed. "That explains it." Emily brought a tray of lemonade. Mark leaned back in his chair. "You know, it's funny how this all worked out." George nodded. "Funny and lucky." Emily looked down at Oliver. He could have ended up anywhere. Oliver lifted his head and looked at George again. Mark smiled softly. "But somehow, he found his way back to you." George shook his head gently. "No." He scratched Oliver's chin. "He found his way to the right family." Oliver rested his head against George's knee. Peaceful. Content. The room filled with quiet warmth. Outside, birds chirped in the trees. The neighborhood moved slowly through another calm afternoon. George finally stood after a while. "Well, I should get going." Oliver stood immediately, tail wagging. George laughed. "Yeah, I know." He crouched again for one last scratch. "Don't worry, buddy." Oliver looked into his eyes. Calm. Trusting. George smiled. "I'll be back." Oliver wagged once more. Satisfied. He walked George to the front door. Just like always. George stepped outside. Then turned back. Oliver sat at the top step, watching him. But this time,